Welcome to Pat's Cast. Should we be worried about Drake Maye? We might need to be, because there is something about these early game situations under the lights when he knows he's going to get hit, not in practice, but in actual games. Doesn't matter if it's the preseason or the regular season, where you just don't get Maye's best until, later in the first quarter or later in the first half. And we saw it Saturday's game against the Minnesota Vikings. Drake Maye goes out there. Mac Hollins, no further than 5 yards out, nearly throws the ball over his head. He's 6'4". Somehow Mac Hollins comes down with it and gets a first down, overthrows Pop Douglas on what should have been an interception, and then most of the other passes were overthrows or just a little high from Drake Maye. And this is coming off of two excellent practices against the Vikings where he looked very poised and very measured out there, even early on in those practices. And we saw it in the first preseason game with the strip sack, throw the invisible football play from Drake Maye that ended up in the Washington Commanders' hands. And we saw it a lot last season in early game situations. The first time he ever took the field in the red throwbacks against the Texans. Drake Maye just throws a horrible pick, don't know where he's going with the football, and then he settled in and got better as the game went on. And that's kind of been a common theme throughout his career. He was like that at the University of North Carolina. But the problem is, you put the team in a real hole in those situations, and I'm also starting to think it isn't necessarily Drake Maye gets better as the game goes on. It might just be Drake Maye is not better under pressure. And I hope that's not the case. I really hope that's not the case, and I hope this new Josh McDaniels offense brings him the structure that he needs to be more than competent in those situations. But look at last year. Remember the Tennessee game? All anyone remembers was low red zone. They're down 17-10. Drake Maye scrambles for about 15 seconds and somehow finds Ramondre Stevenson in the end zone, sends the game to overtime. But people forget the drive before that. Drake Maye lost the football, handed the ball to the Titans, and they went down and took a 17-10 lead. And then in the overtime period, Titans go down the field, kick a field goal. Drake Maye throws it like 70 yards downfield, ends up in the safety's hand, and end a ball game against the Titans. And when do you feel the pressure most as a professional athlete? It's when you take the court, take the field, and it's at the very end. Clutch situations where every second really matters out there. The middle, the meat of the game, the 80% of the game, you're really not feeling the pressure, right? You're out there, you're back in muscle memory, doing what you need to do, but something about the clutch situation, something about first taking the field, Drake Maye has really struggled with. And there are lots of quarterbacks that have been like this. Greg Bedard pointed out, Brett Favre was this way in Green Bay. Similar gunslinger to Drake Maye. Mobile with the football. Often threw picks early, often threw picks late. How many times did Packers fans just throw their hands up at the end of games because Brett Favre made a boneheaded throw? There are modern players like this. Jameis Winston is kind of like that as well. I hope Drake Maye is better than Jameis Winston. As much as we love Jameis Winston and all that he brings to the game of football, and as much as we pray that he ends up with a television job, or at the very least a podcast at the end of all of this, I hope Drake Maye is a lot better than Jameis Winston. But Maye's feeling the pressure a lot right now, and he's under a lot of pressure, generally, which is why I'm a little bit concerned heading into the season. He has a new head coach in Mike Vrabel who is really on him every day in practice, really pushing him to be that leader that he wasn't as a rookie. Then you have Josh McDaniels bringing in this super complex offense that Tom Brady ran to a T, that gives him all the tools he needs to succeed, but there's a lot of tools in that toolbox to choose from. There's a lot of pressure with that. He's a second-year player, feeling the pressure to be a real leader, to take that year two leap that we're all expecting from Drake Maye, and frankly, it will be a disappointment if we don't see it. It's also his personal life, right? He was just married. And had the entire Boston sports media say that he donated all of his wedding gifts to charity, when in fact it was a fake story on TikTok that Scott Zolak saw and just read it off on the air, and then the entire sports media ran with the story. By the way, if you ever need a great prank, that's it. All right, the day after your buddy's wedding, go up to Aunt Rena, someone who cannot keep their mouth shut, someone who's going to just tell everyone they know. Just go up to Aunt Rena and say, hey, I heard Steve is giving all of his wedding gifts to charity. And then just watch it spread like wildfire. And then when it gets back to Steve, he's all pissed off, but he has to do something, right? And you're not going to give all the wedding gifts. Like, why would you give wedding gifts to charity? That doesn't really make all that much sense. You write a check, right? So Steve now has to write a check, and instead of going to Bora Bora, they're now in a minivan camper in Joshua Tree. That's how they're spending their honeymoon. Great prank if you ever need to really bust your buddy's balls. That's the way to do it, is tell Aunt Rena he's donating all of his gifts to charity. Force Steve to write a check. Steve in this scenario. Aunt Rena is Scott Zolak in this scenario. And hilarity ensues. I think it's a fantastic idea. And that's really the pressure that Drake Maye is under right now, is dealing with the marriage and the new team, the new head coach and the new offensive coordinator, and stepping into that year 2 role. And the fact that he's not as charitable as we thought, And that really is, that's a cold welcome to New England, because New Englanders, they know how to guilt trip people. That is how New England and England, frankly, runs as a society. That's how people are motivated, because they feel morally guilty about something. And Drake Maye was just finally introduced to that. So that is a good welcoming that you want to give him to living life in New England, that basically everything you do is going to be because somebody else made you feel bad about it. Excellent prank. So just go ahead with that if you ever really, really want to have fun after the wedding. He donated all of his gifts to charity. Now, I guess Zolak and May somehow talked it over, and they're all good there. Probably a little bit easier for Drake Maye. I like Joshua Tree. I don't think he went to Joshua Tree. He probably went somewhere very nice for his honeymoon. But the big story here, of course, is Drake Maye's under a lot of pressure right now, and I don't think we're going to see the best out of him until he really is in, week 14, week 15 at this point, because this is just who he is. This is the style of player he is, and maybe there are ways to coach around it. I'm sure Josh McDaniels has some ideas. Throw a slip screen early, first drive of the game. Tell Drake to hold on to the football until the last possible second. Make sure he gets hit, wakes him up a little bit, and then he can be back to his normal self. But there's a lot of psychology here that Drake Maye is going to have to figure out. And, he's not the type of guy who's going to easily fit into a system. The good thing about having a pocket passer like Tom Brady is there is no plan B. You can't just bail and run with the football. Plan B was always throw the check down or throw it away or just take the sack. There wasn't, okay, I have to make a play because there's nothing else here, and he made it work. When you always had that kicking around in the back of your head that, hey, I can always just run with the football if I don't like what I see, well, then suddenly there are going to be things that you don't see that are out there. And we saw it in Drake Maye's first drive at Minnesota. Remember when he rolled to his right, found Mac Hollins downfield on the sideline, extended the play, almost threw the ball again over Mac Hollins, who made a spectacular play at 6'4". No way DeMario Douglas would have come down with that. He had vertical route on the far left side, Kyle Williams wide open, and if he had drawn the safety there, he also had DeMario Douglas wide open across the center of the field. Dan Orlovsky breaks this down. Now, maybe Maye was going through his progression, and you start looking right, and he saw that Hollins was going to get open. Maybe he did ultimately make the right throw, but he did hold the football for like 5 seconds on that play, and that is an issue. He holds onto the football often way too long, and he can do that a lot more in this offense than the West Coast offense, which is actually just about timing and rhythm and less about here's option A, option B, option C, here's what I can change at the line. There's a lot more options for Drake Maye in this offense, but I think it also is going to incentivize him a little bit to continue holding on to the football too long. And look, Sean Payton talks about this. I heard Albert Breer talking about this the other day in a discussion he had with Sean Payton. Sacks are not just an offensive line sack. Sean Payton looks at it. He says sacks are mainly a quarterback problem. And I think there is some truth to that, right? How many sacks did Brady or Peyton Manning take, in the second half of their careers? They didn't always have the best offensive lines. Brady, for the most part, had good ones, but that middle portion of his career when, he had Randy Moss and Wes Welker out there, he had some of the worst offensive lines of his career. I wouldn't say he had the best offensive line in 2018 when they won that last Super Bowl, but Brady always found a way to get rid of the football some way, somehow, even if you're just throwing it at someone's feet. Drake Maye takes a lot of sacks, and he's continued to take a lot of sacks over these last two training camp practices on Monday and Tuesday. Now, from what I hear, these are the last two practices open to the media, but we'll see. I think there might be some wiggle room heading into next week. I don't know exactly how that works, but we'll see if we'll continue to get information out of training camp. But on Monday, Drake Maye went 9 of 18 and 11 on 11s, threw 2 interceptions, both to Robert Spillane. So getting intercepted twice by a linebacker. One came on a wrestling-type play with Hunter Henry, and the other was a deep misfire in 11 on 11s. He took sacks from Harold Landry, Milton Williams, and he couldn't take care of the football. And that's really the first practice we've seen in a while where Drake Maye has been turning the football over. Most of the turnovers are in either the preseason games or the Friday practice that was open to the public before the preseason game started. So under the lights, in a real stadium environment, that's when Drake Maye turned over the football. Well, coming out of Saturday's game, which I'm sure Drake Maye is very upset about himself, also took a delay of game penalty at one point. He goes out and throws 2 picks in practice. So what's he feeling there psychologically that's causing that to happen? This is what I'm saying about Drake Maye. He's got to figure this out. Now, he bounced back quite a bit in Tuesday's practice. 14 of 21 passing, but he did take 4 sacks in 11 on 11s. Now, again, I'm not going to sit here and say sacks are entirely a quarterback problem, but they play a part of it. And, this offensive line is a mess right now. They're still shuffling players around, trying to figure out who's going to start at left guard, who's going to start at center. But I'd like to see Drake Maye take less sacks. He's taken so many throughout training camp. And these are sacks where you're wearing the red jersey. You're not actually getting hit. So maybe he breaks a lot of these in actual games. But still, it's happening. You're not getting rid of the football. And in fact, it kind of seems worse than last year. And I think this offensive line is significantly better than last year's offensive line. I'm not saying they're good, but they're significantly better. You had DeMontre Jacobs as your starting right tackle most of the season. Vidarian Lowe as your starting left tackle most of the season. I actually feel pretty good about the tackle positions right now with Morgan Moses, the veteran coming in that's been very durable, even if he's 34 years old. And then, of course, Will Campbell, who, if I read this correctly, was the highest rated rookie from Pro Football Focus the first 2 weeks of the preseason. So coming in as a left tackle and putting up, I think it was like an 80-something grade. I know they're preseason games. He's going up against backups, and he has struggled at times, particularly against Minnesota's starters. You still have to feel pretty good about the situation with Will Campbell. But it's a team sport. The issue with the Patriots and the offensive line, I don't necessarily think it's going to be the tackles. It's going to be the left guard and the center position, like I said, which they're trying to figure out. In today's starting unit, you had Will Campbell at left tackle, Monday, you had Jared Wilson at left guard. Today, you had Ben Brown at left guard. And then on Monday, Garrett Bradbury was at center. And then on Tuesday, it was Ben Brown. So they are considering Ben Brown as the potential starting center. Mike Onwenu, of course, back at right guard, and Morgan Moses, your starting right tackle. I'm a little disappointed that Jared Wilson doesn't seem to be considered in that starting center conversation. I think there's a very, very strong chance, 90% I would say, although he has struggled a little bit in the preseason games, that he's starting at left guard. But then you're stuck choosing between Garrett Bradbury, who's been awful throughout training camp, throughout all the preseason games, seems to run block okay, but can't pass protect to save his life. Or you're choosing Ben Brown, who is a backup NFL center. That's why I'm like, you gotta consider this Jared Wilson thing. So, it is a process. Maybe they'll take a good hard look at it. Maybe Drake Maye will take some snaps from Drake Maye Thursday's game. But has been a good rise for Ben Brown, and he's been impressive for the most part throughout camp. Like I said, he's in the mix at center. He started at left guard, and I doesn't seem to be too much of an issue, but again, that's kind of that major hole. Left guard and center, they really need to figure that out. Morgan Moses seems to be doing pretty well in practices. He's been limited because of the workload. And then Mike Onwenu, I believe he gave up a sack in Tuesday's practice today. I'm really impressed with Marcus Bryant. I think Marcus Bryant is not just considered a backup swing tackle. He will be the backup if either Will Campbell or Morgan Moses goes down. So this idea that it's going to be Vidarian Lowe if it's left tackle, and it'll be Marcus Bryant if Morgan Moses goes down at right tackle. Well, Marcus Bryant has outplayed Vidarian Lowe. He's certainly outplayed DeMontre Jacobs. So feel pretty good about that if either of those tackles goes down, he's gonna go out there, and at least there might be some continuity from that. Of course, he allowed a sack in today's practice, so that's not very good. Mac Hollins went 3 of 3 in team drills these last couple of days. 2 catches from Drake Maye. Drake Maye continues to trust Hunter Henry. Demario Douglas has been a little bit quiet. Who's been really quiet the last couple of weeks of training camp? Kayshon Boutte. He, after essentially being the best wide receiver out there the first couple of weeks of camp, hasn't really done much in these preseason games, although he hasn't been out there a lot. But he's been pretty quiet in the recent training camp practices. So that opens a spot, right? All the talk about Efton Chisholm and him essentially locking up a spot on the roster on Saturday. He might find his way, I'm not saying into that starting lineup, but he's going to get reps out there. I really think so. And then you have Kyle Williams down. Probably not going to see him all week. Out with a concussion after a hospital ball from Josh Dobbs. Opens up another opportunity for Efton Chisholm. We could see him actually make an impact starting week 1. So anyways, the last couple of days on Monday, the defense dominated. Of course, you had the 2 interceptions for Robert Spillane on throws from Drake Maye. Harold Landry had a sack. He had a half sack combined with Milton Williams. Jabril Peppers, a pass breakup. Alex Austin, a pass breakup on Kayshon Boutte. And DJ James is continuing to make an effort out there. And then Keon White had a sack on Tuesday. Spillane had 2 sacks on Drake Maye on Tuesday. Jabril Peppers stuffed Gibson. Kaylavon Chason had a sack with Maye out there. Landry beat Onwenu and Morgan Moses. So maybe the issue here is just the defense is really, really, really good, and the offensive line is just okay. And if the offensive line is okay, we'll see that right away. And we'll see right away if the defense is who we think they could potentially be. Andy Borregales, Parker Roma, basically been perfect the last 2 practices. So, again, that kicker competition going to come right down to the wire. And I think it's a coin flip at this point because that Borregales miss from 57 on Saturday was pretty painful. But so was the ensuing kickoff from Parker Romo, where he didn't even get close to the landing zone, only cleared the Patriots, didn't even clear the Vikings players. So, if I had to guess, if I had to bet money on this, I would say Andy Borregales will probably have the edge, but that's only because they drafted him in the 6th round, in a draft where they really didn't need to take a kicker. So, going to be interesting. Patriots handled practices this week, kind of light on Monday with just sort of a walkthrough, and then Tuesday they were in pads but wearing shorts. So it was a competitive practice today with the offensive starters going up against the defensive starters. Really the last time that we're going to see that, because they're going to start getting into the regular season practices and practicing against the scout teams and prioritizing health and workload for a lot of these players. So I have to say, this has been a very, when all said and done, I talked about Drake Maye and the jitters. That's in-game stuff. He's been better than expected in training camp. He really has, and he really showed it in those joint practices with the Commanders, the 2 against the Minnesota Vikings. Took a lot of sacks, especially in the Vikings practices, and I do think that is partially on Drake Maye, but he has been better than expected. The offensive line has been a mixed bag, but we knew it was going to be a mixed bag. Will Campbell's been better than expected, in my opinion. Morgan Moses, when he's been out there, has been good. Michael Wenu has been sneakily good. It's just left guard and center that has me worried at this point. The defense looks incredible. You have players that are going down. Who knows about the Stephon Diggs health situation? I'm sure he'll be out there week 1. But overall, I'm more impressed with the receiving core than expected. I didn't expect Kayshon Boutte to make this many splashes early on in training camp. Demario Douglas has been consistent. Diggs, for the most part, looks like himself. And, of course, Efton Chisholm is earning himself a spot in the roster. And Kyle Williams had quite a few good catches in that Minnesota game before he was knocked out with the concussion. And if you look at the first preseason game, he was getting wide open. And he was getting wide open on plays where he wasn't targeted in Saturday's game. So I'm not too worried about Kyle Williams. Just hope he's out there fairly soon, dealing with a head injury. But pretty happy with the way it's looked so far throughout training camp. And I think most importantly, the team looks buttoned up. They didn't take a penalty until late in the second quarter in the first preseason game. I think it was the same thing in the second preseason game, which means, Drake Maye had the delay of game. Yeah, okay. Outside of the delay of game, which was Maye's fault, they didn't take many penalties. They look buttoned up out there. I love seeing receivers in motion once again, seeing that Josh McDaniels offense. Drake Maye, that doesn't seem to be an issue. Understanding the offense, changing the play at the line. He checked into a running play on 3rd and 10, and Travion Henderson somehow found his way near the end zone and ran it in on a 3rd and long near the goal line for a touchdown. The running back room might be the best unit on the team. Travion Henderson, I think, is the best running back on the team. Isn't just a pass catching back. He's a guy who can play do anything that you really ask of him. Might be the best blocking running back, even if he's a little undersized. And then, of course, you have the power back with Ramondre Stevenson. You have Antonio Gibson, who's a decent pass-catching back and can be a power back. We know McDaniels likes to rotate those guys in and out, but really encouraged with Henderson. Brings an explosive element to this team that we really haven't seen in quite some time. And the kicker competition is just an absolute disaster. So that could be a problem. So the offensive line and the kickers are what might screw this team over when all's said and done. But overall, I think it's been a good camp. Been hard not seeing Christian Gonzalez out there, but he will be out there for week 1. Seemed like just a minor hamstring injury, but they're being cautious about putting him out there. I'm feeling pretty good about this team. I think 9 wins is more than achievable. I think the ceiling is 11 wins based on their schedule, but if they had a normal schedule, I would say this is an 8 or 9 win team. But with their schedule, getting to 9, unless Drake Maye gets hurt or Drake Maye is just horrendous this year. The defense isn't as good as we thought. The offensive line, Will Campbell struggles. Morgan Moses gets hurt, isn't who we expected. It looks old out there. They should be able to get to 9 wins. I really, truly believe that. And I think if they get to 10, then it's hard not to say this season was a massive success. But I would say anything less than 9, this season is a failure. And, I heard Felger and Maz talking about this. Can you have a bad season from Drake Maye and still get to 9 wins? They said, no, I think you can if you work around it, right? The defense is really good. McDaniel schemes around it. They run the football a lot. With their bad schedule, maybe they can get there to 9 wins. But the most important thing is Drake Maye taking that year 2 leap, or at least just being competent out there in running that Josh McDaniels offense. And look, I think they're going to run the football a lot. That's the strength of this team. I think the offensive line is actually a good run blocking unit, not a great pass blocking unit, but a good run blocking unit. Maybe the best running back room in the NFL, potentially. That's probably a reach, but a very good running back room. They're going to run the ball a lot, and that's going to open up play action and keep defenses on their toes and allow Drake Maye. It will make Drake Maye hopefully look better than he actually is. And maybe he's going to be great this year, and then it's really going to open up Drake Maye, and he's going to be in that MVP conversation. I don't think it's going to be quite that, but it's going to be a run-first football team. They're going to use play action a lot, and they're going to make big plays downfield off of that. It's not going to be death by 1,000 paper cuts like Tom Brady just because Drake Maye isn't that quarterback, but there will be a little bit more of that. Check down throws, quick slants up the middle, and hopefully Efton Chisholm is part of that and makes a real impact. But that's it for this episode of Pat's Cast. If you're watching on YouTube and you like this video, be sure to smash that like button. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, or subscribe if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'm Brad Whitaker. I will see you on Thursday after the preseason finale against the New York Giants.